Good morning. Today we're going to go into chapter 3, and it talks about the United States is each community is part of a larger social order. If you had benefit of seeing Jay Ibsen when he was here, the Holocaust survivor, he mentioned that our community now is the whole world because they're just a phone call away. Before it used to just be a tight neighborhood. But in these instances, for crime purposes, we're talking about small communities, not larger communities. And it talks about the U.S. Constitution, individual rights to freedom, and a social contract. I don't know how many of you know what a social contract, but a social contract is the contract between one party and the other party as far as, for example, police have a social contract with the public to provide peace and order and a safe place to live, just like their mission statement says. You can also get build social credit, which is more or less points that you earn with the community. For in other words, if you're open with the community, you share in the community, you invite the community to participate, things like that. That's building social capital points. So that's an entirely different thing. But it's something that every agency should have. And they talk about how they define community. You know, a geographic area served by a police department or law enforcement. Communities can be smaller than that, served by one police department. And a feeling of belonging in a community. When I was growing up, communities were very tight. I grew up in Hampton Roads, so there was a lot of DOD, and our community was predominantly white, but it had some diversity in it. And that was my community. My community was basically as far as I could ride my bike, which when I was growing up wasn't very far. But it's larger now because people are more mobile. And it's important that officers have to understand community. For example, my daughter's, and I've talked about this before, my daughter's community in Charlotte, it's a development. That's their community. And a police officer is assigned to that community. What binds that community together? Well, it can be different things. It can be geographic location because it's a neighborhood and it's gated. It could be a neighborhood like my daughter's it's got other places surrounding it, but the neighborhood's kind of a unique unit. It's got an HOA, it's got a pool, things like that. So community can be different in different parts, and it's that glue that binds them. For example, everybody's a member of this HOA, so they're part of this community. Doesn't mean they can't be part of two communities, because they can. I told you about social capital, the strength of the community's social fabric. If there's cooperation and sharing between all members of the community, not just the police in the community, but the local government in the community, the churches, and everybody has an equal part and contributes, and they're open with each other. That's social capital, and that builds a strong fabric. The trustworthiness obligations, trustworthiness is an issue right now for public safety. Those are things we need to work on in a lot of, particularly larger communities. You got level, you got public fabric, and things like that. And I know I'm going kind of fast. I'm trying to catch us up. Some of you may have already heard about the broken windows theory. In other words, if you get a broken window in a rundown place and you leave it, it promotes more broken windows, more crime. The same theory, it's an easier to look at when you look at graffiti. Graffiti is best taken care of, or the problem of graffiti is best taken care of if it's taken down as soon as it's put up. If it stays up, it brings more graffiti. If it's taken down immediately, you can have people putting it back up, but that kind of stops that process, and it's just that one person. Same things with broken windows, unmowed grass, all kinds of things that make an area look rundown can contribute to that. Those aren't the only things. And what I want, just like it says in the slides, one of the things I want you to tell me is how you think broken windows theory affects crimes in neighborhoods. I've been in neighborhoods where people didn't mow their grass regularly, you know, and they had stuff in the yards. It was a very good neighborhood. I've been in neighborhoods that were the same and were not good neighborhoods. So let me know what you think about those types of neighborhoods. Other factors that decrease or negate the sense of community, increasing diversity, value groups within a given clash, prevalence of violence, unresponsive community, all these types of things can interfere with building of community. And whose responsibility is it to start that community? Well, it's both sides. It's not sides, it's everybody. It's the police department, it's the community, it's the local businesses, it's the government, it's the fire department, it's water, public works. It's all everything. Local churches, local civic organizations, they all have a stake in that neighborhood. So when you want to build communities, that's where you start. If you talk about smaller communities, there was one community in Waynesboro. It was actually, that community was basically an apartment complex. And we had lots of problems with crime there and gang members coming over. Most of the people were illegal immigrants. I, as chief, didn't give a darn if they were illegal immigrants or not. That's a federal law. I'm not enforcing it. But I needed to build trust with those people. And one of the things with those immigrants, illegal, undocumented aliens, however you want to call them, one of the problems we had is that they were afraid to complain to the apartment owner that they were having trouble with the lighting was bad and gangs coming in and stuff like that, and they needed something fixed in their apartment. They were afraid to say anything because they were afraid he would report them to ICE. We found out about this because we kept going back and back and back with numerous calls for service. So we went in and discovered, okay, there's a problem here. One of them's a non-responsive homeowner, apartment owner, and one of them was we needed to do something to build a sense of community. What we did is we took the police department, the fire department, planning, code compliance. We took the health department. All of these groups went into that apartment complex on a given day, on a particular day. And what we did is we went through there. Fire department can force the apartment owner to bring the building up to code. Health can make sure that all the children are up on their immunities and things like that. Waste management was there. They helped clean up. It was right next to railroad tracks. It was trash all over railroad tracks. They sent a crew down there and picked up all that trash. Fire department made sure there were smoke alarms. They provide them if they don't have them. So doing that, build a sense in that community. We also went in there and helped them put in the local churches helped donate this, put in a playground for the kids, and we actually had a block party. So essentially what happened was we took care of the problem with the landowner, the apartment owner. We, and I mean not just the police department, but I mean the entire the government. And then through the civic organizations, through the people that lived there, we built a trust because they knew we weren't going to try to turn them into ICE or anything of that nature. It ran the bad people out. And it helped when the apartment owner and his wife got separated and she got the apartment complex. She was much easier to deal with. But that puts it on a micro level. You have to do these things on much, much larger levels. And it takes a lot more people and a lot more time. And in this case, it was an unresponsive community because they were afraid of being deported. It could be a community that doesn't trust the police. So you have to build these relationships. That's why they're so important in order to do anything. Law enforcement, local government, state government, federal government, and the community, it's all supposed to be a partnership. And when you don't build those partnerships, things fall apart. There's lots of ways you can crack down on crime. The book talks about relocation of crime and criminals to neighboring areas. If we go in and do selective enforcement in one area, we might just push the criminals into another area. That's not what we want. We want to stop it. Back when I started in the police department, the object was you do some selective enforcement, they move into the county, your problem solved. That doesn't solve the problem. So we've learned that that doesn't work. They talk about the ecology of crime, the tipping point. That's where it reaches a point where a stable environment starts to go south, or the white flight, which is where when diversity moves into the area, some people move out. A lot of things can cause people to move out. Trashy neighbors that run down your property value, all kinds of things, loud noises. But that has been a problem. I was fortunate to grow up in Hampton where it wasn't that bad, that we were diverse. There was still segregation when I was very, very young, but it changed. And we were diverse because of military population. So to me, I didn't see the problems growing up that there are in larger cities where they don't have something like that, a large DOD presence where so many people are in the service. They talk about the classical theories. You'll get some of that in criminology. Routine activity theory, positives theory. They're all theories on how crime occurs. Not all of them are right, but not all of them are wrong. So there's a lot of things within that, those theories that contribute to crime. So you might not agree with one part of the theory, you might agree with the other part of the theory, or the theory might be right in this situation, or it might not be right in this other situation. So you got to think about those things and understand the differences. So look at those theories and let me know what you think about those particular theories. If there's one theory that you happen to believe in more than the other. If you've taken criminology, you've already had a lot of these, but look at them and let me know what you think. This talks about dividing the class into each group into 3 groups, but we're not going to do that because we're an online class. So what I want is each of you to take one of those theories. Just pick a theory. If you all happen to pick the same theory, that's just the way it goes on online, or I can assign them. But just go ahead and pick a theory and tell me what you think about how that theory affects you. And here's a way to do it. Pick a theory that starts with the letter it starts with is closest to your last name in the alphabet. That way we'll have a diverse opinion on how those things work, and it makes for good conversation. What about demographics? Do they have anything to do with crime? Does it have to do with relationships between government and the community? Well, of course it does. You know, you got homogenous communities that are basically similar. You've got heterogeneous policies that are unlike and dissimilar. And then you got ghettos, and ghettos is actually a term that came from, it was a small community. It came about in World War II with the ghettos that the Germans put together. But we're talking about a different type of ghetto. But when you look at the types of societies, when immigrants came to the country, let's pick Chicago. You know, Italians stayed with Italians, and you know, Germans stayed with Germans. They all went into their own community. Now, you still have some of that, but it's not near as prevalent as it used to be. We didn't have any of that when I grew up in my area, but I know of areas where it did occur. And those things affect how you deal with the community, how you build those partnerships. And why is that? It's because they got different cultures. All cultures are different. So you got to learn how to deal with them. When I worked in Williamsburg, the predominant culture was Greek. Greeks own most of the restaurants and most of the hotels. So I had to learn that the culture, when they're kind of like Italians and Hispanics, that they're very animated when they talk and they get loud. It's not aggression. It's just the way they express themselves. So I learned after the first couple times that, hey, they're not being aggressive at me. It's just that's the way they talk. And that's the way they act. Mannerisms. My wife is half Italian. My son and my wife, my middle son, can't talk without being animated. So you just got to learn those things and accept them, no matter what the culture is. Racial and ethnic profiles in America, the shifts. You know, we've become a bifurcated society, haven't we? We seem to have separated in the last five years or so. And, you know, I just don't see it getting any better at this point. I think it eventually will, because we like that. We will persevere, but it's bad. And then they talk about, you know, the haves and have-nots, and then the middle class. You know, the have-nots are going to complain, the haves complain, and the middle class is kind of stuck in the middle. For example, if I was to move my resources from a high-income area to a low-income area because of crime or some other issue in the community, we're just trying to make it safer, or we're trying to build community. People in the wealthy ones who never paid any attention to us before complained because they weren't seeing any police officers. Well, they probably didn't before either. Or they just happened to see one just drive by happenstance. They were still getting patrolled, but my resources were directed where they were needed. They weren't needed in the wealthy class. They were needed here. So, you know, you get that kind of bifurcation where the haves think they should have and the have-nots want it because they don't have anything. So it does cause a problem in society. And there's lots of theories and lots of people with opinions on how that occurs and why we have such a diverse. It's not as diverse as it was when we first started our country, because there are a lot more people who are wealthy now than there were. But it's still an issue. So it's an issue in societal terms. So what do you think about that? Is it something that's promulgated by the government, by society, by culture, by race? What exactly is it that causes that bifurcation, do you think? Let me know. I got some theories on it. You know, when we talk about building a role in community safety and quality of life, it has to be a partnership, and it has to be a strong network of community organizations, just like it says in the book. You know, it fosters cohesiveness, it shares intolerance, critical behavior, it encourages citizens to cooperate in controlling crime. It's all about partnerships. And I put some videos on there to show where some departments are doing things to build those partnerships, particularly large departments. It's hard to find videos on small ones. But in most of the small ones, it's not as big of an issue as it is in much larger departments because of the population base. But it still exists. They talk about competition with private security. The one thing we need to look to distinguish is security is different from policing. And security has a very important and vital role. Some security has no training, some has very limited, some has very good training. For example, nuclear power plants, that's private security. It's all done by a private industry, and it's something that law enforcement couldn't do. Those people are highly trained. When you get into security at chemical plants like DuPont or Invista now, and some of the others, it's very well trained security and very high. Some of the stores have very trained security staff. So it's not that they're not. There was once a feeling that they were just underpaid people with no training. A lot of that has changed. An awful lot of that has changed, and they serve a very important place in society. There are still some that are just fly-by-night organizations, but they're starting to die away. For example, in Virginia, you have to be certified as a public agent, which means you have to go through a lot of training. And that's not being armed. If you're going to be armed, you have to go through an entirely different program. So there are starting to be state regulations for private security that require how this happens. An example would be Kings Mill in Virginia, just because I'm familiar with it. Not all that police department is armed. Some of them are they're security officers. Some of them are police officers. And they have very different levels of training. Some people don't like private security. We certainly don't want to, in my opinion, we don't want to privatize the police department, because if you do, where is the federal regulation? You know, you've got to have some controls, and it's like privatizing prisons. You lose some of that control, and we don't want to. We want to make sure it's regulated, but at the same time, we don't want a national police force. The chapter also goes into formal and informal powers. We have that in our own groups. City governments have formal and informal power. Just because somebody's on city council doesn't mean that they have the power. It can be wealthy people, non-wealthy people outside. For example, in Seattle in the 1800s, there's a book called The Sons of the Prophets, I believe is what it's called, and it talks about who had control or who had the greatest influence on local government in Seattle during particular times. Sometimes it was the wealthy, sometimes it was the prostitutes. The prostitutes gained a lot of trust and a lot of power, when they put sidewalks in, because they didn't want to walk in the mud. So you could fall in and out of power. So there's always that informal power structure that's behind the scenes and not doing anything. You see it a lot in government where special interests are paying for things. Look at the federal government. How many of them leave office and aren't millionaires, or significantly wealthier than when they were when they got in there? There's been a lot of talk about community justice. Some places have tried it. Some of the controversial issues are the plea bargaining, diversion, sentencing, rehabilitation, alternatives to prison, victims' rights, capital punishment. The thing that we have to understand when we do that is that there has to be some kind of training on the community if they're going to get involved in public safety. Not that they have to go to the police academy, but it's like me going in and trying to regulate how a nuclear power plant is going to do their business. I don't know the business, but they know their customers. Even though they keep raising their prices, they know their customers, they know what they need. Same is true in this situation. You got to make sure, well, here's a classic example. Roanoke City. there was some problems between the residents of the city, particularly lower income, and the police department, that they weren't doing their job, particularly when it came to internal investigations. So what the chief did, which I thought was very good, he picked people throughout the community. They didn't have to be leaders in the community. He just picked people who were interested throughout all the communities in the city. And he brought them in, and he found ones that wanted to participate in the program. And they sent them to, several nights a week where they were doing stuff to learn about police work, the laws, how they're applied, and things like that, and things that you have to do, things you don't have to do. And he gave them complete access to all the internal affairs investigations. They had to sign a non-disclosure agreement, but what that did is it gave the public an independent person that would go in there and they would look at it, and when the public thought, oh, they didn't do what they're supposed to do, they could go talk to their representative in that area and he could say, yes, they did, I read the report, or you're absolutely right, we need to do something about it. But it gave them complete access. It went a long way to building a community in Roanoke City. And we actually have 2 officers now that did internships there for Mary Baldwin when they were seniors. Civil review boards, it's the same thing. You can have civilian oversight, but they have to understand the aspects of the job. Public safety is not like any other job, just like being a doctor is not like every other job. So, if you want to critique and provide oversight, you have to understand what the job is and how it's applied, and that's important. And in education, one of the most important parts of developing a relationship, because in education, you learn from each other. There's an exchange of information, and you can work out problems that way. It's much easier. I've always found it to be great. I learn as much from you students as I do from anything else. So I really appreciate the feedback that you give me. Some people don't like it because they don't understand it. I'm on the fence. I wouldn't be opposed to having a public review board as long as they understood, the law. And when I mean not just the law when it comes to what's illegal and what's not illegal, the law when it comes to how things happen, civil liability involved, and the things they have to do, the things that it has to go through the mind of the officer when they make decisions. If you know all those things, then you can provide a good critical analysis of what's going on. One of the best things that happened, it was in Charlotte actually, and I use Charlotte a lot because I'm familiar with it. They have a very good police foundation, and that foundation hosted a luncheon every year. It's expensive for a table, but they pay for everything. They pay for the guest speaker. This year it happens to be Sully from the movie Sully about the crash in the Hudson. They pay for the venue. They pay for the meal. They pay for everything. All the money that's collected goes to the foundation, and they buy a particular thing for the police department. One of the things they bought was a mobile firearm simulator. And why that's so important is you just understand the things that have to go through your mind before you make a decision to shoot. It's very complicated. Actually, more officers hesitate than shoot. That might be hard to believe, but it is true. And it's just very complicated, and it's a very quick decision to make. But if you ever have a chance to go through one, do. It's a really interesting aspect. Your heart rate will go up, everything else will go up, and everybody ends up making mistakes on the simulator. That's the whole purpose, so you can learn from the mistakes. So that comes into striking a balance. What are they going to get involved in? Oversight committees, what are they not going to get involved in? They certainly don't want them in there involved in the whole program. That's like having politics get in the whole program, the whole department. But there are certain aspects that really involve the community. All aspects involve the community, but some are really critical. That's not such a bad idea. Like I said, I'm on the fence, but I think in the right application, in the right city, pick the right people, it can work. And it has worked in other places. Do you think civilian review boards are necessary in today's policing? Now remember, you're making a decision based on something that you may not know about. You get more information when you're on review boards, so you can make a more informed decision. But it's difficult. Think about if you were to provide oversight for something that you weren't familiar with. I mean, if you want to do inequity, that's fine. But when you get down to the technicalities, that or the minute details of how it functions, you really have to know something about whatever you're oversight on. For example, the Transportation Safety Board. Only one member can be a civilian. Everybody else in the Transportation Safety Board has to have some kind of expertise in the field, because you're looking at accidents involving buses, trains, planes, all those types of things. Citizen patrol. What do you think about citizen patrol? I think it's got its place. The thing is now you got to worry about citizen patrols being victims of people that are upset with the police department. But they serve a very, very good purpose, and it builds things. It's just like citizen police academies. I think it goes into that too. Yeah, it talks about it on the next slide. Citizen police academies are very, very good for bringing in members of the community. If you're going to run one, the first people you invite are reporters and leaders from the community, so they understand the job. And then you get other people to go through it. My brother in Baltimore went through it, and he understood how certain decisions are made, why they're made, and some of the implications when you make bad decisions. And they even went through firearms training to learn just how difficult it is to make a decision and how hard it is to shoot under pressure. That's one of the things about why doesn't the officer just shoot to wound? Well, you're using deadly force. You can't use deadly force if you're not authorized to kill. And trying to shoot to wound somebody when you're being shot at, that's not as easy as it seems. What about volunteers? Citizen volunteers. We had an auxiliary police, they still have an auxiliary police department in Waynesboro. It was very good. We had very good citizens who came in that went through the police academy, or modified police academy. They're required to go through specific training by DCJS, the Division of Criminal Justice Services. And they provided a very important function. Only very few qualified to go on patrol by themselves. Most of them rode around with officers, provided backup. They would be there for parades and special events and provide security at special events like summer extravaganza, things like that. We also had it in Waynesboro, although it wasn't as big and as formal. Very important program. And then you get people in the community, they can go back and talk to other people in the community, and it's all about building partnerships. You got to build those partnerships. Other services that citizen volunteers can do. Fingerprinting children. Now we go to DNA for children, and we provide some services for that. Patrolling shopping centers, checking homebound residents, house checks. In Williamsburg, we did house checks, and when we did house checks, somebody had to go by that house once a shift, every shift, and you had to check every door. It was a small community, so we could do it. Our calls for service weren't that big. You go into large communities, calls for service can be really bad or really high. Then you don't have time to actually do that. But that was a great community service. Your citizen volunteers could do that kind of thing. Event planning, clerical support, all sorts of things, because police departments just don't always have the funding. Matter of fact, they never have the funding they need to do their job. It's kind of like owning a boat. You know, all the parts are expensive. So think about those things when it talks about community policing and how you can do community policing. We've already talked about it, and some of you made suggestions on how we can build relationships with minorities and things like that. But this is a much broader scope. So talk about it and let me know what you think. I'll put a thread on. Take care.